Greetings and salutations, friends. As promised, we are today going to be looking at how the Tau Empire defends one of their planets. After last week, we had a look at how the entire Empire defends itself, combining a carefully calculated program of necessary expansion to provide the Empire with the resources and living space it requires for its own protection, whilst also running the diplomatic razor's edge of taking worlds and influence away from their much bigger neighbors, whilst also ensuring that the Tau do not draw too much attention to themselves. And of course, when that careful balance is unavoidably broken on occasion, the Tau rely on their recently formed combat fleet, the kor'or'vesh, to deny the enemy access to their core worlds, and destroy the enemy in the void, where the Tau's superior technology and usage of massed volleys of highly intelligent guided torpedoes gives them a serious edge, even against enemies that outnumber them. But of course, sometimes things just quite simply go wrong. The razor's edge dance of Tau politics comes down on the wrong side. They piss off the Imperium a little bit too much, get a little bit too greedy, and incite a little bit too much of a response. Maybe too much of a response even for their fleet to handle. In those circumstances, the only option left is to engage in a good old-fashioned ground war, and of course, occasionally, the Tau will also run into enemies that not only do not give the faintest flying fuck about their diplomacy, but that also have a fleet far bigger, far more scary, and almost perfectly designed to counter theirs. Once again, the Tau will have to fight on the ground like the rest of us savages. So how precisely does the Tau Empire go about defending a planet when their diplomacy and their fleet has failed them? That is the question we are going to be answering in today's video. So where do we start? Well, naturally, we begin on the planet in question itself, with its inherent defenses. For the Tau Empire has garrisons on its worlds, just like the Imperium does, although to a different degree, and often with a bit of a different role as well. Within the Imperium of Man, PDF forces are usually used as a more heavily armed version of local law enforcement. They exist primarily to maintain the peace, law, and order of a planet, and destroy any subversive insurrectionist elements. And whilst theoretically they are also expected to offer resistance against any external invader, they are neither equipped nor trained for such a task. For the Tau, however, they view the local garrisons slightly differently. They do actually have an active role to play in enemy invasion, and they have a far smaller role to play in crushing insurrectionists because, well, Tau society will probably already have taken care of that particular problem. But before we get into the garrison's role to play in actual warfare, let us also mention what kind of a garrison we are talking about. The Tau Empire is small, its military resources are very limited, and it is surrounded by enemies. It is entirely reliant upon being able to react to and meet any enemy invasion with overwhelming force, so as to crush it quickly and decisively, thereby not risking a two-front war, which could be disastrous to the Tau Empire. But whilst this strategy is both wise and absolutely necessary, it is also quite a complex one, especially for a relatively small empire. Firstly, it requires the maintaining of large standing armies, complete with dedicated naval elements that can both protect the armies whilst in transit and carry them to the threatened areas. It is also vital that no time is wasted in dispatching this rapid reaction force. Tau space travel is relatively slow by comparison to the usual warp drives, and so every effort must be expended in ensuring that the preparatory phase before the fleet can sail is made as short as possible. This, in turn, necessitates the Army and Navy be made up of experienced personnel, with an established order of battle in place, making sure that everyone knows where they are supposed to be and what they are supposed to do when they get there. This veteran force also, remember, needs to be large enough to immediately meet the enemy and engage them outright. The worst thing the Tau could do would be to either drip feed their limited forces into an enemy's maws, or engage in a long, drawn-out war of attrition, which they will almost inevitably lose. And since even in an empire as centralized and directly controlled as the Tau Empire, raising, equipping, training, and organizing fresh troops takes a long time, the reaction force needs to be as big as possible. This in turn means that the Tau are always desperate to free up experienced soldiers from active deployment and move them back into the reserves, where they can both be used for further operations and in case something large and unfortunate sneaks out of the void. And of course, the best way to free up aforementioned experienced soldiers is to take the various tasks that require their attention and transfer them over to the local population of the planet, hence the need and use for a garrison force. And as mentioned, it will primarily be created from the local population, be they human, Tau, or any other of the member races of the Empire. These troops are, on occasion, although very rarely, used in operations outside of the Empire's borders, with the notable exceptions of the Kroot or the Vespid, which presumably the Tau have figured are ideologically invested enough in the greater good to be trusted to bring it to the ignorant savages of the galaxy. But despite not being used all that often in offensive actions, they still do fulfill their primary role of freeing up fire warriors to carry out those very same actions. They do also take part in the defense of their own world, and this is where the PDF of the Tau differentiate themselves quite a bit from the PDF of the Imperium of Man. In the case of the Imperium, the local planetary defense forces are expected to offer at best token resistance. As with all things within the Imperium, there are of course exceptions, but by and large the PDF is expected to occupy pre-prepared positions and eventually get overrun and slaughtered to the last man, hopefully in doing so giving yet further information to the Imperium as to the nature and force of the threat in question, or possibly even hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. In contrast, the Tau's own PDF forces are not expected to offer any active resistance against an invader, not right off the bat anyways. Their primary task, when the arrival of an enemy in system is confirmed, and it is also furthermore confirmed that the Tau Navy will not be able to stop them, is to begin the evacuation of non-combat personnel, preferably off-world, but if that is not possible, they will be taken to, relatively speaking, safe areas of the planet, where hopefully they will be able to remain hidden until the conflict has passed. The next step is to prepare the various settlements on the world's surface for the none-too-gentle administrations of the invader. The first part of this process is to activate the various automated defenses that virtually all Tau settlements have, in the form of drones either roaming the streets or being placed into pre-prepared hardpoints, from which they can offer some resistance against any enemy that get too close. Secondly, they will go through the settlement in question, ensuring that any piece of technology that is sufficiently advanced so that it should be kept secret from the enemy is either prepared for dismantling or demolition, and that any piece of machinery vital to the survival of the colony is also prepared either for dismantling and transportation or destruction. For example, a water filtration plant or a power station. These are things that it would be nice to preserve if possible, but it would be far worse to allow the enemy to keep intact. Then the garrison will move on to its own preparations. Scattered across the planet, there will be various points that have been pre-prepared for logistical caches. In these areas, the defenders will store additional weapons, spare parts, food, water, and various other essentials for continuing the fight. These caches will also be used as rallying points for scattered troops and areas of relative safety where the Tau can reorganize their troops. And then finally, with all of the preparations having been taken care of, preferably before the enemy arrives, the garrison will scatter across the planet into smaller mobile formations. Not quite the full-scale hunter cadres of the Fire Warrior castes, but a rough simulacrum, designed not for open combat, but rather scouting and reconnaissance. Because the primary role for the garrison forces from now and until the arrival of Tau reinforcements is not to engage the enemy in open combat. Instead, when the invader begins making landfall, the various garrison forces will begin to congregate in the areas that the enemy have decided to set down in, whereupon they will begin scouting out the enemy's forces, determining their strength, their disposition, and their apparent objectives on the planet. During this phase, the garrison forces are not to engage the invaders unless directly threatened, and even then, they will only continue the engagement for long enough to ensure the withdrawal of the garrison forces. The main objectives of the defenders at this point in the conflict is to gather as much information and intelligence about the invaders as possible, whilst also keeping the garrison forces intact. If the enemy begins moving, then the scout forces will begin to shadow them. If the enemy begins moving towards population centers, then hopefully those will already have been evacuated, and the Tau forces will simply just abandon the ground and the settlement. The only exception to this rule of thumb is if the enemy is making their way towards a location of such strategic importance that the loss of that area would result in the irretrievable loss of the planet as well. For example, if the planet is entirely reliant upon just a single starport, and the enemy force is so large that the incoming Tau reinforcements would not be able to deploy a significant enough force to contest the enemy without the use of said starport, then the defenders will be forced to engage in active defense. Though even in this circumstance, they will try to avoid having to defend the starport itself. Instead, the various garrison forces will place themselves in between the enemy and the objective, skirmishing with them, slowing them down, and attempting to pull off elements of the enemy's forces by attacking their flanks or rear or threatening their logistical supply lines, forcing the enemy to dedicate yet further troops to chasing down an elusive and extremely fast enemy. Meanwhile, word of the invasion will be reaching the Tau's heartlands, the Sept Worlds, along with the message that the kor'or'vesh have either chosen to allow the enemy to make planetfall, or have been unable to stop the enemy's fleet. The Tau Navy will of course attempt to engage the enemy's naval elements and try to destroy them in orbit, as that is a key cornerstone of their defensive strategy. But this is not always possible. Either the Tau Navy has tried and failed to do so, or have quite simply decided that the enemy's naval elements are too formidable, and that the only result in engaging them head-on would be massive damage to the Tau fleet, and very little damage to the invaders. In these circumstances, kor'or'vesh elements will begin to withdraw from the enemy's navy, giving them plenty of space and attempting to hide in the outer edges of the system, or making use of any planetary bodies or asteroid fields to conceal their presence. They will then observe the enemy's fleet, whilst relaying any additional information to the Tau Empire, and scouting for any possible opportunities to strike at the invader, raiding their supply lines, or possibly even needling the main fleet, but they will not risk their own naval capacity, as they will seek to join with the incoming reinforcements before making any overt moves. Local defenses have now done everything they can do in the situation, and the ball is in the Ethereal's corner. They will now have to decide how to react and how much force to react with. As mentioned, the primary idea of the Tau strategic doctrine is to react with overwhelming force to any invasion, so as to crush it quickly and avoid a far worse scenario where the Tau Empire will be split, attempting to resist multiple invasions at once, which they simply do not have the resources to do. Aforementioned lack of resources is also the reason why the Tau Empire is almost forced to try and defend every single planet, whereas the Imperium of Man is more than happy to trade an individual world for yet more time and space, both to formulate a response and also to truly perfect both the size and composition of said response. For the Tau Empire, this is not a luxury they can afford, as even the loss of a single world could potentially wipe out several percentage points of the Tau Empire's overall income of resources and manpower. And a couple of percent may not sound like a lot, but remember, this is on a planetary scale. That would translate into trillions of man-hours, millions of potential recruits, and God Emperor only knows how many billions of tons of raw resources. These are not losses that the Tau Empire can easily absorb. And while of course there is always underlying it all a cost-benefit calculation, meaning that in some cases if the planet in question is particularly poor or sparsely populated, the Ethereals may still decide to abandon it, the bar for doing so is set very, very high. And even if the planet is to be abandoned, a small reinforcement fleet will be dispatched to aid in the evacuation of the planet. The civilian population first, and then as much of the garrison as possible as well. Initially, the Tau Empire thought that they did not necessarily have to fully evacuate a planet, because they assumed that everyone else in the galaxy would operate by much the same rules and aims as they were operating, attempting to capture and convert the populace. But the Damocles Gulf Crusade quickly dispelled any such naive notions. Just because the local population was not offering any form of resistance did not mean that they would not be butchered to the last man, woman, and child. But assuming the Ethereals decide that the world is worth fighting for, they will begin gathering up all the information they have available to them, first and foremost from the Tau Navy elements in system that either attempted to resist or avoided the incoming invasion fleet. Furthermore, they will also gather the information relayed to the fleet that should still be hiding in system, assuming it has not been hunted down and destroyed, about the size and the apparent goals of any ground forces deployed by the invaders. This is where the centralized command structure enforced by the Ethereals really begin to shine. Whereas in the Imperium, it would take weeks if not months for this kind of information to filter its way up the chain of command until it finally reached someone with the authority to dispatch even local reinforcements. In the Tau Empire, these reports can all be compiled and presented before the Ethereal Council within hours. The following debates would then potentially take hours, maybe even days, depending upon the scale of the problem, but by and large, reinforcements can be organized and dispatched within a matter of days, or weeks at the absolute most. Additionally, as the information will continue to flow into the Council, the Ethereals will be able to make updated decisions based upon new information, whilst again in the Imperium, a new kernel of information could take yet further weeks and months to make its way up to the person that at that point may already have dispatched the reinforcements. What the Tau Empire may lack in resources and personnel, it does to some degree make up for in flexibility and rapidity of action. And so, when the decision has been made to rescue or abandon the planet, the reinforcements are dispatched. But before we can talk about what the reinforcements will do when they arrive at their target, we must first have a look at the reinforcements themselves. Because the Tau Empire organized their troops in a rather fascinating fashion, which is in fact based on the organizational structures of the Tau when they were but savage, low-tech barbarians inhabiting their homeworld, before the coming of the Ethereals and before their rapid, near meteoric ascension to a galaxy power. And one of the most obvious holdovers of their past as hunter-gatherers is how they name their basic military formation, the Hunter Cadre. Now, the term Hunter Cadre does not necessarily refer to any specific type of formation. Rather, it refers to a specific organizational structure that can then be designed to fulfill a variety of tasks. For example, you can have a Hunter Cadre specifically organized around the idea of reconnaissance. You can have one organized around the idea of rapid relocation of firepower. Or you can have one organized around the idea of anti-tank warfare. They are all Hunter Cadres, but of course their specialization and their composition vary considerably based upon the task they are expected to fulfill. Hunter Cadres can also be very flexible and modular. Auxiliary troops such as additional fire warrior squads, additional broadside battlesuits, or specialized troops in the form of Kroot or Vespid allies can be attached or detached to the Hunter Cadre as the situation demands by headquarters. And of course, there is also the less specialized, more flexible Combined Arms Hunter Cadre, designed to be able to engage with and solve a wide variety of battlefield situations. Utilizing fire warriors for basic infantry firepower, XV8 crisis teams for rapid reaction troops, Kroot and Vespid allies for close combat and melee support, Pathfinder teams both to designate targets for the heavy fire support elements and to provide additional scouting, along with light skimmer teams used for reconnaissance, and sniper teams used both for delaying actions and to harass the enemy. And then finally, you top it off with XV88 broadside suits and hammerheads, both for direct heavy fire support and indirect artillery aid. And all of these various elements are then placed under the auspices of a dedicated command team, consisting of the commander himself and a bodyguard of crises battlesuits. This results in a very compact and very flexible formation that can theoretically both engage virtually any target and also punch well above its weight class, utilizing combined arms tactics to ensure that the total power of the Hunter Cadre is considerably greater than the apparent sum of its individual parts. However, the Hunter Cadre has one glaring weakness, and that is its size. It is a very small formation, barely amounting to a company, and it is heavily reliant on highly specialized units that are very powerful, but also very few in numbers. For example, a more balanced style of Hunter Cadre may only possess 2 or 4 XV88 broadside battle suits. If these are destroyed, then the anti-tank capabilities of the Hunter Cadre will be near crippled. It does have fallback weaponry, but the majority of its anti-vehicular weaponry will then be destroyed. Or, if its auxiliary formations of Kroot or Vespid troops get taken out, suddenly the Hunter Cadre is extraordinarily vulnerable to an enemy that can get up close and personal. This means that these formations can be rendered combat ineffective frighteningly quickly. Now, it should also be said that the Tau way of warfare is very heavily focused on not taking casualties wherever possible, so they have already developed a system to counteract this. But before we get into their tactics, one further note about their organization. At first, it may seem somewhat reminiscent of modern warfare, where combined arms operations is at the heart of the Tau Hunter Cadre, either by placing a wide variety of specialized weaponry inside of the same formation, or by having several Hunter Cadres operating nearby one another, so that when the time comes to attack a target, they can all converge and make use of their different specializations to support one another. However, the Tau do this in miniature. as a flexible hunter-gatherer will barely reach the size of a company, whilst in our modern military, the smallest formation capable of relatively independent action with a full support system consisting of command, recon, artillery, usually of a light sort, along with anti-tank and perhaps some mechanized and armored elements, would be a battalion. And you would have to go all the way up to a regiment before you have a formation truly capable of independent operations, maintaining both their own fully formed command structure and logistical structure. And so I believe it is probably more correct to compare a Tau hunter-gatherer to a World War II era German-style formation referred to as a Kampfgruppe. And this, in large parts, is also how the Tau operate. We'll get into the comparison in a bit, but the Tau have developed a military doctrine where they seek to maximize their own advantage whilst minimizing the damage they will take in return for fulfilling a specific battlefield objective. And the objective part is of particular importance. The Tau do not like engaging in running gunfights. They do not like engaging in large-scale battles if they can avoid it. Instead, they prefer to gather detailed information about the enemy, and then strike where he is weakest, establishing a series of objectives that will, once all carried out, act like a series of falling dominoes, resulting either in the outright neutralization of the enemy, or better yet, the destruction of their ability to offer effective resistance. You do not need to kill an enemy soldier to ensure that he is no longer capable of fighting. And to fulfill these various objectives, they will also utilize the forces best suited to them. In other words, they will create ad hoc formations, usually of multiple hunter-gatherers, or even reinforcing individual hunter-gatherers with specialists so as to better fulfill their particular objective, be it taking a specific point, pinning down an enemy formation, or engaging their heavy armor. This fulfills the idea of a Kampfgruppe far better than it does the relatively rigid structure of a modern-day military formation. It is a ad hoc, often improvised formation, focusing on combined arms warfare to make up for relatively limited numbers that is formed to fulfill a specific battlefield task, or alternatively, to complete a particular objective. We'll talk a bit more about Tau's strategy and tactics in a moment, but for now you have a general idea of what a hunter-gatherer is, how it may be formed, and how it is supposed to operate. So, now that the Ethereals have decided that the planet in question is indeed worth rescuing, they will figure out precisely how much force is needed. As usual, it would be preferred if the kor'or'vesh could take care of the situation. If simply just dispatching further naval reinforcements would result in the destruction of the enemy's naval complement, or the severing of the enemy's logistical lines, then regardless of how many troops the enemy may have on the planet, they would be de facto trapped and could be dealt with at the leisure of the Ethereals. Unfortunately, this tends to be a rather long-term strategy, as in the case of several planets, the enemy's troops may be able to sustain themselves on the planet for years, if not indeed decades, continuing to deny the Tau Empire access to the world's resources, and may even, in the end, force the Ethereals to dispatch ground forces just to get rid of them. And, to begin with, it may require a very large commitment on behalf of the kor'or'vesh to destroy the enemy's navy. And with Tau's space travel being as relatively slow as it is, that is always a bit of a risk. Dedicating a dozen combat vessels, for example, to head out to one extreme end of the Tau Empire could quite easily mean that you have a dozen less ships with which to react to another invasion, and it could take months to bring them back even just to their starting position. So in our example, we will assume the dispatch of Fire Warrior ground forces. The very first thing, again, of course, will be for the Ethereals to determine how many Hunter Cadres and what kind of Hunter Cadres to dispatch, depending, of course, upon the enemy. If they happen to be fighting greenskins, they probably want to focus on large numbers of Fire Warriors mounted in Devilfish transports, enabling them to swiftly move into formation, deliver a devastating volley into the greenskins, and then get the fuck out of Dodge before the Fire Warriors get into close combat with hulking chopper-wielding monsters. In the case of the Imperium of Man, however, shit gets a lot more complicated a lot more quickly. What is the composition of the force? Is there a lot of infantry? A lot of tanks? Are there space marines? What's the Imperial Aeronautica presence like? What are the ships? Are they capable of orbital bombardment? Are there titans? So on, so on, and so on. In which case the Ethereals will seek to dispatch specialized formations to deal with each and every threat, so that if there are space marines, they will have plenty of crises battlesuits to counter them. If there are large numbers of armored vehicles, they will have plenty of hammerhead gunships or swordfish on station, and if there are titans, then mantas will be needed, and probably in considerable quantities as well. And this, of course, is where the scouting reports from the garrison becomes absolutely invaluable, as it allows the Tau to tailor their response to the specific enemy forces. Once this phase has been completed, the reinforcements dispatched, and then finally arriving in the system, they will begin landing on the planet. And the Tau possess an absolutely excellent air corps. Manned by the air caste, they have access to high-capacity, highly versatile vertical takeoff and landing Orca dropships, and plenty of escorts and strike fighters, like Barracudas, Mantas, Razor Sharks and Tiger Sharks, along, of course, with the dedicated Sun Shark bomber. They are able to land large numbers of Hunter Cadres very effectively, very swiftly, and quite safely as well, although they will go to great pains to avoid a direct engagement with the enemy during this phase of operations. The Tau do not possess good void-to-surface assault capabilities. They do not have drop pods, of course, and they do not possess the super heavy landers of the Imperial Guard, able to both deploy entire regiments at once and provide direct fire support from several heavy weapon turrets. The Tau are not particularly fond of the idea of losing potentially an entire Hunter Cadre along with the dropship they rode in on. That just doesn't sound like a worthwhile gambit to the Tau. To deploy these forces safely, however, they will need a fairly significant Navy presence to ensure that the unloading process can be carried out without the enemy's interference. And of course, they don't need security just in the void either. They also need to make sure that the landing troops are sufficiently far away from enemy strike craft capabilities, marauders, aquillas or lightnings, etc., and also far enough away from enemy ground forces to allow the Hunter Cadres to unload and then scatter across the planet. Assuming the Tau forces have arrived relatively intact and safely, they will then seek to join up with the garrison, which, hopefully, should still be relatively intact, assuming they have followed their orders of observing the enemy and avoiding contact as much as possible. With contact with the garrison established, the Tau can then get updated information on the location, the disposition, the strength, and the apparent objectives and movements of the enemy. They can then begin coordinating offensive and defensive operations against the invader. The Fire Warriors will begin initiating their own scouting operations against the enemy, usually possessing far superior equipment and specialized personnel to do so in the form of specialized Pathfinder teams mounted in swift hovercraft devilfish and potentially stealth battlesuits that are virtually invisible. And now that the proper fire warriors have arrived, the professionals, they'll probably go over all of the actions already taken by the garrison, checking on the civilian population, checking on the settlements, and re-evaluating whether any targets need to be held at all costs, and so on and so on. And of course, updating themselves on the current situation. If an enemy is heading towards an area that requires immediate protection, then the fire warriors will have to leap in and join the defense as swiftly as possible. If, however, assuming the enemy has not been able to carry out any truly threatening maneuvers just yet, because again, the Tau consider the vast majority of ground on a planet to be entirely expendable. They will happily surrender hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers of ground for a better position, because of course the ground can easily be retaken, whilst the loss of potentially very limited reinforcements, those are considerably more difficult to recoup. Once the professionals have satisfied themselves that everything has been done properly and to the correct standards, then the work of actually getting rid of the enemy can begin. First and foremost, as already mentioned, with yet further reconnaissance. The Tau are very, very, very fond, as you probably noticed, of reconnaissance. In fact, the Tau are almost as fond of scouting as they are of space communism, and, if afforded the time to do so, they will take their sweet-ass time gathering intelligence until they know more about the enemy than the enemy knows about himself. Of course, most opponents are not quite so considerate as to simply allow the Tau to poke, prod, and observe them for all eternity, and the Tau Fire Warriors will have to engage in small, well thought out and planned running skirmishes with the enemy, ambushing armoured columns, pinning down infantry formations, and generally making existence for the enemy commander a living hell. During this phase of operations, the Tau will primarily rely on a strategy referred to as the Kaiyun, or the Patient Hunter. The entire idea here is to organize a series of rolling ambushes, where the enemy will be drawn further and further into a continued series of carefully laid out traps. The Tau will also utilize this to direct the enemy's forces away from vital installations and to where they want them to go. For example, if an Imperial armored column is advancing towards something the Tau would rather keep, then they might attack their flanks. Then, when the tanks respond, they bring up their XV-88 broadside battlesuits, engage the armor vehicles, and when the Imperium then goes, "Oh shit, let's send in the infantry," the broadside battlesuit retreats. The infantry pursues, and then runs into groups of fire warriors in prepared positions to engage the infantry. Then, when the tanks are brought back up again, hammerheads will swoop in and engage the tanks, whilst piranhas extract the infantry. Then, as the infantry is brought up again, and so on and so on and so on. Essentially, the idea is to continuously force the enemy to commit themselves to attacking the Tau, whilst the Tau strike and then fade away again. In this way, they will continue to inflict damage upon the invader, whilst gathering yet further information and purchasing time to deliver the coup de grace, the mont'ka, or killing blow. Once the Tau have finally decided that they have indulged their voyeuristic tendencies for long enough, they will begin preparing what will hopefully be a decisive blow. They will develop a comprehensive and highly detailed plan, including all or virtually all available forces. Having identified the enemy's weak points, they will use their rapid hovercraft IFVs and gunships to converge on these weak points. They may also now organize their hunter cadres into larger temporary formations to better fulfill particular objectives and to concentrate their forces more effectively. For example, 3 to 6 hunter cadres may be combined into a single TOV, or similarly, 3 to 6 TOVs may be formed into a cabal. Each of these groups is then assigned a carefully thought out and selected series of objectives to fulfill one part of a much greater strategy. The tactics that the individual formations wish to use to fulfill their objectives is up to the local commanders. High Command only decides what is to be done. How it is to be done is up to the local commanders. In our general scenario, the first stage of the battle would see the Tau strike at the weakest enemy formations, perhaps the previous victims of repeated Tau ambushes, for example. In this opening fight, the Hunter cadres will be unusually heavily concentrated, ensuring complete and utter local superiority and a rapid breakthrough, somewhat reminiscent of the German idea of Schwerpunkt. Once the front has been breached, however, they transition into a rapid, fluid rush into the enemy's rear lines, seeking to drive deep into the enemy's command and logistical positions that have already been located and identified by infiltrating Pathfinder and stealth suit teams. This part is far more similar to how the Soviet Army's deep operations doctrine was supposed to work, but micromanaged to a far greater degree. Assuming everything is going to plan, this should then lead to the larger Tau formations once again splitting into individual or pairs of Hunter cadres, racing across the ground, launching attacks on the enemy's communications, command, and logistical infrastructure, while some forces turn around and begin harassing the enemy's front line from the rear, complicating any moves they may make in an effort to withdraw or protect their own supply lines. The end goal with all of this is to leave the invaders' large formations starved of food, water, ammunitions, medical supplies, and, perhaps most importantly of all, instructions. If the enemy then begins to withdraw in an attempt to get back off the planet, then the Tau will more than likely simply let them, as retaking the world was their objective all along. And if the enemy has now been suitably convinced of the wisdom of simply handing the planet back to the Tau, then that sounds quite perfect. If the enemy, however, is still set upon offering yet more futile resistance, then the Tau, after having raised the enemy's rearward supply lines, logistics, and communication, will then begin sectioning off the enemy into large pockets. They will surround them, harass them, and try to break them off into smaller and smaller portions. By gradually reducing the enemy's numbers into more and more manageable chunks like this, the Tau both ensure that if they have to deal with them to the bitter end, they can do so with overwhelming force, minimizing the risk to their own troops. But preferably, the enemy will eventually realize that further resistance is utterly pointless and will only result in their own death, and therefore surrender to the Tau. And obviously, the Blueberries will encourage this activity as much as possible by bombarding them with propaganda, preferably created by previously captured individuals from the very same invasion group as the guys now encircled. As you can probably imagine, seeing as this is, well, kind of what we did in our world as well, this strategy is, once properly carried out, very effective, and can allow a smaller force to defeat a much larger force with a great deal of economy of force. However, there is a little bit of a problem here, isn't it? Whilst this strategy is very effective against a conventional enemy, one that has command centers and supply lines to be severed, not all enemies in the 41st millennium are quite so conventional, are they? And whilst the Tau are a very flexible force, developing new stratagems and way of fighting various enemies, it does take a little bit of time to actually develop these things. In addition to the two established strategies, the mont'ka and the Kayun, they have already developed several other variations. The Rinyon, for example, which is essentially one of large-scale open-field envelopments, or the Ripyaka, to fight foes like the Tyranids, for example, where the Tau will simply have to continue to hammer at a point to reach, eventually, the higher-value targets, the Synap creatures, behind a horde of Tyranids. But some enemies are a much bigger problem to the Tau than others. The aforementioned Tyranids is definitely one, but the Tau are starting to develop a bit more of an idea on how to fight them. Generally speaking, the Tau suffer the absolute most when they are fighting an enemy that is swifter than them, or has more firepower than them. A few examples, for example, of nightmarish foes for the Tau would be the Eldar. The Eldar utilize the same extreme specialization of weaponry and units that the Tau do, except even more so to an even greater degree. They also wish to develop advanced, intricate, in-depth battle plans just like the Tau, but the difference between the Tau leaders and the Eldar leaders is simply that the Eldar have been doing this for hundreds upon hundreds of years. They will, in all due likelihood, be able to formulate a strategy and then execute it far more swiftly and decisively than the Tau will be able to. But luckily, the Eldar will probably be more than happy to coexist with the Tau, as long as the Tau keep well clear of any of their precious maiden worlds, of course. A far worse opponent might then be the Dark Eldar, who have already shown quite an interest in the Tau, or more specifically, the Kroot. The Kroot's ability to eat the cadavers of defeated enemies and absorb various beneficial attributes, oh, that is something that many members of Dark Eldar society, the homunculi in particular, find very fascinating. The Prophet of the Flesh launched a considerable raid upon Pek, the Kroot homeworld, gathering both a rich bounty in Kroot corpses and live captives. They were eventually driven off, not so much because they were actually driven off, and more so because they had literally run out of cargo space, and additionally, just as a little bit of a signing card, they left behind mountains of corpses that spelled out a message that translated roughly to "Welcome to the feast." And in all due likelihood, besides possibly the Tyranids or maybe the Necrons, the Dark Eldar are the single greatest existential threat to the Tau Empire. If they develop a taste for Tau and begin launching terror raids into the small Tau Empire, with their own ships being able to move, of course, much faster than any Tau vessel, they can launch countless raids upon Tau worlds, stealing away and butchering millions, if not billions. And whilst they may choose to avoid Sept worlds, since they are far more heavily defended, this would place the Tau Empire in exactly the position where it does not wish to be, under attack from multiple areas at once by an enemy that's faster than them. Bit of a nightmare scenario, really. And then there's the two other threats. Now, we've already briefly touched upon the Tyranids in the form of the so-called Hive Fleet Gorgon. Hive Fleet. Splinter Fleet, but hey, details. Gotta make the Tau sound relevant somehow, I suppose. When the Tyranid arrived in Tau space, they attacked a single Tau world to begin with. The Tau world was called Shadraig, and the Tau, having no clue what just hit them, panicked a fair bit. Their original garrison force was attacked and overrun in many areas, their usual doctrine of scouting the enemy and avoiding contact not really working out all that well against the Tyranids, who were able to land massive amounts of Tyranid spores and biomass, both in the form of hormigants, termagants, and of course gargoyles, all across the planet. The Tau Empire, however, responded swiftly and dispatched reinforcements immediately, which turned Shadraig into a massive all-out battleground, where on the one side, the Splinter Fleet was continuously pouring yet more and more biomass onto the planet after having devoured a nearby moon, and the Tau pouring yet further and further reinforcements onto it in an attempt to stem the Tyranid tide. Unfortunately for the Tau, the Tyranids turned out to be just as flexible and adaptive, if indeed not even more so, than the Tau. Every time the Tau came up with a new doctrine, a new strategy, or a new tactic, the Tyranids simply just created a new type of creature adapted at defeating that particular stratagem. They tried deploying drone turrets, for example, to engage the Tyranid hordes, reasoning that they could produce a lot of drones, and since the drones were armed with fairly powerful rapid-fire weaponry, they could effectively engage and gun down hordes of smaller Tyranid creatures. The Tyranids responded by deploying bigger, badder, and stompier creatures who didn't give a shit about the relatively light weapons of the drones. When the Tau then sent in their broadside battlesuits and their hammerheads to knock out the big creatures, hordes upon hordes upon hordes of little flyers and little runners came swarming out from between the legs of the massive monstrosities, overrunning the Tau's dedicated response. And so it went, on and on and on. The Tau eventually figuring out certain weaknesses in the Tyranid swarm. Like, for example, if you killed the particularly big baddies, then the lesser ones would revert to a instinctive state, in which they were far easier to deal with. Eventually, the Tau discovered that if they radically changed their combat doctrine at certain stages of the fight, then it would take a moment before the Tyranid hive fleet could react, and re-engineer its creatures to meet that specific threat. During these windows, when the Tau were slaughtering the Tyranids in large numbers, they would punch forward, aim towards the Synapse creatures, and destroy them. Then, when the counter was deployed by the Tyranid fleet, the Tau would once again drastically change their approach, changing out their weapon system or the nature of their attacks. And once again, when the Tyranids were adapting, they would strike forward and snipe out yet further Synapse creatures. This was a tactic that proved quite effective, but probably one that could only actually work against a small splinter fleet, since it could simply not deploy enough biomass to counter any eventuality. If this was a true Tyranid hive fleet, I imagine it could simply just build a catalogue of all the little tricks the Tau tried to pull, and then simply deploy every single solution simultaneously. Clouds of gargoyles rushing at any and all crises battlesuits, hordes of termagants rushing down broadsides, ravenous travelling underground to ambush fire warriors, and stealth suit teams finding themselves detected and picked off by massive hulking monstrosities with highly evolved sensory organisms. But luckily for the Tau, it was just a splinter fleet, and eventually the battle for Shad Raig was won, at least in a way. The planet had been halfway devoured by the Tyranids, and was essentially abandoned by the Tau after the conclusion of the battle. And unsurprisingly, this terrified the Tau. Their small empire cannot afford to lose worlds, and in this case, they had lost a world even though they had won the battle, even though they had expended the resources and the manpower to win the battle, they had still lost the world. Oh my, that is particularly bad news. And the news was about to get even worse, because the Tau did not manage to finish off the Splinter Fleet, which then slinked off into space and began raiding a handful of Imperial worlds, and also managed to nom a couple of Tau planets as well, before then returning just as strong as it had been at Shad Raig. And this time, it had learned far more of the Tau's tricks. Already, the kor'or'vesh combat fleet had been rendered virtually useless against Gorgon. Their highly advanced, super long-range torpedoes were simply swarmed by smaller Tyranid bioorganisms, little more than living bombs that ate their way into the weapon's warhead and then detonated in splashes of acid, touching off the entire weapon. and the Tau's superb void superiority fighters, attack craft, and bombers ran into the exact same overwhelming hordes of bioorganisms that happily rammed themselves into engines, into intakes, and into weak spots, splashing the ships with highly corrosive acid, which then ate its way into the delicate control mechanisms of their void ships. All of a sudden, the Tau Navy had been reduced to its most basic weaponry. Railguns, solid slug weapons that could certainly attack and hurt the Tyranid, and the Tyranid did not have a great deal of response against that, except of course for simply making their carapaces thicker, harder, and more shock-absorbent, meaning that whilst the railguns worked, even they did not work well, and when a Tau fleet is reduced to close-range firepower, it's a bad day to be in the aircast. And things weren't all that much better on the ground either. We've already talked a bit about how the Tau eventually managed to develop tactics to fight the Tyranids, because all of their old usual tactics, striking at weak points and then looking for command structures and supply lines, well, that sure as hell didn't work against the Tyranids, now did it? But things were about to get even just a little bit worse. For whilst the Tau Empire was desperately scrambling to understand and counter this new threat, it was already moving through the Tau Empire, devouring outlying colony worlds, and one of these systems under attack was the Kar'mais system. Unlike Shadraig, it was not close enough to the Tau heartlands to swiftly receive reinforcements, and since the Tyranids had at this point also learned that the best way to deal with the Tau was to overrun them swiftly, were not about to give the garrison enough time to prepare itself. But then something a bit odd happened. The Tyranids usually attempt to avoid Necrons like the plague, yet in this particular instance, they had apparently not noticed a Necron tomb on one of the local moons of the system. And as luck would have it, the Necron tomb was getting ready to fully awaken. When it did, it swiftly eliminated a considerable chunk of the Splinter fleet. The rest of the Tyranids then retreated, not wishing to engage the Necrons outright. The Tau, having no fucking clue what just happened, decided to invite the Necrons onto their planet for a feast in their honor. The Necrons obviously accepted, and then butchered the Tau. Because Necrons. Already somewhat traumatized by the appearance of the Tyranids, the Tau Empire decided to respond to this new threat by evacuating nearby systems in a hope to consolidate so that they would not have to defend as large of an area, which, again, they wondered if they could actually afford to do. Unfortunately, as the worlds began their evacuation, Hive Fleet Gorgon, quote-unquote, once again reared its ugly head, intercepted several of the refugee fleets making their way towards the Tau homelands, and om-nom-nommed every last little blueberry on board. The Tau had been having an easy ride in the galaxy up until this point. Their only true enemy was the Imperium of Man, and it couldn't really be bothered to wipe out such a minor threat when the Tyranids were licking so intently upon their door. But with the arrival of a Splinter fleet, a Necron dynasty, and the apparent attentions of the Dark Eldar, it would appear that the Tau's free ride is about to come to a rather sudden and violent end. Good luck, blueberries. You're gonna need it. Right, so all the way at the end of the episode here, we're gonna talk a little bit out of character now, shall we? Because there are a few things I want to talk about the Tau. The Tau are an interesting little race. I like quite a lot about them. The idea of combined arms warfare, for example. The fact that they are an up-and-coming empire instead of a falling one. The fact they're a small one instead of a massive one, and so on. They do contribute a fair bit of freshness to the universe, in my opinion. And now that they're no longer just the good guys of 40k, but instead creepy space communists, and they are absolutely communists, by the way. It is a society in which the state, in the form of the Ethereals, have complete and utter control over the society. Not just productions or industry or daily lives, but down to the very role that each individual Tau citizen has from birth until they die. And everybody is working not for themselves, not for the betterment of their society, their lives, or anything like that, but for an overriding ideological goal. A goal in whose name anything and everything can by definition be justified because it is the greater good. And of course, who defines the greater good? Well, the Joseph Stalins of the Empire, of course. If the Ethereals decides that tomorrow the greater good means something else than yesterday, nobody will argue. And if they do, well, they clearly must get with the program, or be considered heretics against the greater good. But one thing I absolutely fucking hate about the little blueberries is the way in which a lot of their fluff is written. Games Workshop desperately needs them to be relevant, and so the Tau are attacked by an Imperial Crusade and a Tyranid hive fleet, and then you actually read into it and you realize that, oh, a crusade, heavy quotation marks, a hive fleet, heavy quotation marks. And also the way that the Tau fight their individual battles. The Tau should have no way to take over, for example, a hive world. It should not be possible. Each and every hive on that planet should be a de facto unassailable fortress for the kind of equipment that the Tau have. They simply cannot fight the way they wish to fight inside of a hive city. They would completely and utterly unavoidably be dragged into a grinding, horrifying, bloody, endless close-quarter urban war against billions of crazed, zealous, fanatical Imperial citizens and hive gangers. In its current state, there is just no way the Tau Empire should be able to take on a hive world without literally bleeding itself dry in the process. And yet, it did just that. Because, apparently, Tau shields. And that is one of my biggest pet peeves as well. Tau shields. They go from completely and utterly worthless to being able to withstand orbital bombardments, and they can mount shields on Riptide battlesuits able to withstand Death Strike missiles. A Death Strike is a real incredible threat against a Titan. And yet the Tau have shields that can stop it, do they? On a fucking Riptide. Bullshit. And then, of course, there's how they beat Hive Fleet Gorgon as well, by having an Imperial fleet that was supposed to take part in the Damocles Gulf Crusade appear out of the warp, then fight the Tau briefly before the Tau talked reason into the Imperial Crusade commander, and he went like, oh, right, the Tyranids, yeah, I guess they are dangerous. Shall we be friends now? At that point, it's not even just a plot point anymore. It is one of the most absurd cases of writer-itis I have ever seen, beyond the Blood Angels deciding to join forces with the Necrons, I suppose. I guess that one is even worse. Basically, Games Workshop is trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want the Tau to be the underdog, the up-and-coming force in the galaxy that has to fight for every inch of ground gained, and also the nation that is absolutely just traumatized by the vicious nature of the universe, but they also want them to be a significant enough galactic force to take on the Imperium, to take on the Tyranids, and so on and so on. Which is ridiculous. The Tau should be kept as what they are, the underdogs. Their story should be one of a young, naive race wandering out into the galaxy, and discovering that the galaxy is a fucking horrible place. And then we can get to see how they react to that galaxy. How they react to the fact that they are but one small part of a very large, very uncaring place. And, of course, how the Ethereals maintain control over their population. That would be a good story. That would be a cool story. But Games Workshop are kind of forcing them into a different mold, attempting to have the Tau be both that and a major galactic force like the Imperium at the same time, which doesn't really work in my opinion. But, anywho, enough random rantings about the Tau. I'll wrap it up there. Until next time, I have been Arch, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till next time, have a good day.